Well, Kamal, we did cover this extensively on the podcast yesterday. Axel Rudakubana pleading guilty to those 3 murders in Southport and 10 attempted murders and terror offences. And we sort of looked at it from the perspective of whether the Prime Minister and indeed the state sharing information about the killer's background would have in any way prejudiced the trial. And we discussed at the time the Southport riots happen. Starmer's handling of it all is criticised. He appears to be equating those concerned about what has happened in Southport with being far right. So I thought it was interesting, the timing of this. We wake up and suddenly 8:30, the Prime Minister's giving a speech at Downing Street, going to absolutely address this issue head on. Should we have a listen to what he said?
The responsibility for this barbaric act lies, as it always does, with the vile individual who carried it out. But that is no comfort. And more importantly, it is no excuse. And so, as part of the inquiry launched by the Home Secretary yesterday, I will not let any institution of the state deflect from their failure. Failure which, in this case, frankly, leaps off the page. For example, the perpetrator was referred to the PREVENT programme on 3 separate occasions. In 2019, once, and in 2021, twice. Yet on each of these occasions, a judgment was made that he did not meet the threshold for intervention, a judgment that was clearly wrong and which failed those families. And I acknowledge that here today. Throughout this case, to this point, we have only been focused on justice.
Keir Starmer, they're referring to Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary's announcement yesterday, immediately after the guilty plea, that there would be an inquiry. I think they've learnt here, let's just do the politics before the actual policy failures that we're obviously going to be speaking about. But the politics of this, Keir Starmer has clearly, I think, probably been told, rather than come to his own conclusions, that he has to be quicker and more decisive in these situations. What happened with the grooming scandal was that demands were made by Kemi Badenoch, by Nigel Farage, by many in the media, including the Telegraph, for a full public inquiry. He, first of all, didn't respond very quickly. Second of all, he responded that there wouldn't be an inquiry. Third, he responded that there would be inquiry. There would be 5 local limited inquiries, which probably didn't satisfy either side, i.e. those that didn't want an inquiry and those that did want an inquiry. Politically disastrous for Starmer. Here we see Starmer, via Yvette Cooper, announcing the inquiry straight away and then coming out at 8:30 in the morning in the Downing Street press room, surrounded by union flags, saying this is what we're going to do. So in terms of the politics, do you think, Camilla, that agree or disagree with what he is doing or the claims he is making, he at least has politically acted with a little more vigour?
I agree with the vigour point. My problem with the speech and the Q&A session is that he doesn't have the common touch on these issues, so he sounds very pious and like he's lecturing, and I don't doubt his earnestness. I think he does feel this stuff deeply because he was a lawyer and he was the former director of public prosecutions, and he understands the devastation that crime causes to families, and I think he feels that very, very keenly. And I believe him when he says that the state has failed, and we'll get onto that in a minute when we discuss the Prevent anti-terror programme. But I felt uncomfortable with him once again trying to make it about him. You know, there was a bit where he pivots in the middle of the speech in a bid to kind of like cleanse his own record, I think, as head of the Crown Prosecution Service, where he starts linking it to the grooming gangs and then making the point that he was the only person who did anything about it 14 years or whatever ago. And I just felt a bit uncomfortable. I felt like saying, mate, this isn't about you.
I agree with you, Camilla. Let's just hear how he did bring in the grooming gangs issue into the Southport announcement.
So I want to be crystal clear in front of the British people today. We will leave no stone unturned. I was the prosecutor. who first spotted failures in grooming cases in my institution, the CPS, 14 years ago. And I was the prosecutor who first did something about it by bringing the rape gangs in Rochdale to justice. And so my approach as Prime Minister will be no different. If any shortcomings are now holding back the ability of this country to keep its citizens and its children safe, I will find them and I will root them out. Because when it comes to justice, the failure to be transparent is not only disgraceful on its own terms, it is also the enemy of strong communities. It spreads suspicion more widely and allows division to win.
Also, the other problem with it is I don't find him that credible when he professes to be tough on crime. It's a little bit when I hear Yvette Cooper talking about smashing the smuggling gangs. And I'm like, ideologically, you're quite opposed to smashing anyone. Keir Starmer, it's not like listening to, say, Priti Patel as Home Secretary talking about justice. You sort of believe in that a bit more. I think he's slightly stymied by the fact that he's got this sort of human rights lawyer shtick about him, which kind of debases this idea that he's really, really tough on law and order, which I appreciate is slightly contradictory because he was the Director of Public Prosecutions. Do you get where I'm coming from?
Yeah, it's quite hard. For someone like Keir Starmer, he would imagine himself to be quite nuanced, whereas politics is fought in technicolor, and he's not a technicolor character. And you are right, the difference between a lawyer and a leader, as Kemi Badenoch keeps saying, is very, very sharply defined. I think a couple of things which are really of substance as we move on to the policy issues. This issue about the cover-up and sharing of information, I think will be really, really important for us to discover what is the best method to protect due process, but to allow the public to feel they're being given the facts. I think that's a really important point. And then the second is, what is terrorism? And this idea of the lone killer, not maybe motivated by an ideology. It appears thus far, and I had a really good chat with Martin Evans, our crime editor, about, is this an Islamist attack? And a number of people have suspicions that it is connected. He did download an Al-Qaeda journal. Or is this a lone killer who disappears into an online world of extreme violence, misogyny, racism? There are people who go down that track who are not, in the traditional sense, terrorists, because they're not fighting for any kind of ideology. And Starmer has said we need to rethink that. And I think if only he could sell his arguments in a way the public could understand, which is what you're calling for, they would say, yeah, okay, we think that's a reasonable point to make.
The Nigel Farage argument is that he should have admitted that Rudakubana was known to the authorities at the time that he was arrested and charged. Having studied the law, we have to give people the presumption of innocence. If you said to the public, yeah, he was known to the authorities, they would therefore have a prejudicial view of him. It's difficult, this, because we also know that it happened in broad daylight, and it was so brazen, and that there were eyewitnesses that he also tried to kill, that it probably, had he pled not guilty, been a rather open and shut case, that the evidential burden against him would have been huge, which is no doubt why his lawyers have persuaded him to plead guilty, because it looked as if it was all stacked against. Having said that, if we believe in the rule of law in this country, which, by the way, is probably the best model of law, the best legal system the world has ever known, and has been aped across the world because of that, we have to stick with the fundamental principles, which are that defendants have the right to a defence, even though that defence may be very weak. They also have the right to be heard before a jury that hasn't already made its mind up. If information does come to light ahead of any trial that could anyway jeopardise that and give the defence an excuse to say, sorry, but we can't hold this trial in a fair manner because of what's been said and done, then we are on really shaky ground. You know, people often say, well, the law's an arse. Generally, the law works quite well because if somebody is banged to rights, they get sent down because the evidence is all pointing towards them having committed the crime. If they're innocent, there isn't the evidence and therefore they go free.
And actually, the law has operated relatively quickly here. We now know who did it, and we are now going to have more information on him. And this person is going to be sentenced on Thursday to life imprisonment, and more will be found out about him. How do we find people before they act is also a part of the question for the public inquiry. And this brings us to Prevent. Now, Prevent was the anti-terrorism response following the 9/11 attacks and the 7/7 attacks in London. Was there a way of identifying risks before they acted horrifically and murdered people? And the problem, though, with something like Prevent, which is outside the usual security services and the police, you're trying to identify whether someone, before they have acted horrifically and murdered people, whether for ideology or other reasons, before that act happens. And that is really, really difficult. And how much of an honest conversation are we able to have about some people will get through, but some people shouldn't get through? So if you look at Rudakubana being referred 3 times, he didn't reach apparently the threshold of extremism with a possibility of acting. That was also true for Usman Khan, the London Bridge terrorist who killed 2 people in 2019. It was also true for Jake Davison, the man in Plymouth who shot and killed 5 people, including his mother, and then shot himself. His mother had referred him to Prevent.
Yeah.
But Prevent gets nearly 7,000 referrals a year. There were lots of complaints that people were being referred, school children were being referred for making a racist comment or for making an Islamist comment, and suddenly they were referred to Prevent because there was this new duty to refer. But this organisation, which is probably somewhat similar to the parole system, it supports community groups, it supports de-radicalisation policies, it just doesn't have A, the intelligence and knowledge, or B, the enforcement powers to really understand how do you pick very bad people. And I think here Keir Starmer did get the argument right. In the end, the people who are responsible for murder are the murderers.
Yes. William Shawcross carried out that independent review into Prevent. The first report was published in February 2023 and then it was updated in February 2024. The conclusion was Prevent puts the public at risk. And he singled out the fact that it seems to focus too much these days on far-right terrorism than Islamic extremism. And that was a point that was raised. But I think what Keir Starmer has hit upon here, which is a much wider point, is what is our definition of terrorism now? Because the Prevent programme doesn't seem to be capable of staging an intervention because somebody is displaying really bad mental health, looking like they're completely going off the rails, and actually need professional medical intervention. This is about, are people expressing terrorist sympathies which might then be acted upon? In the case of this, at the time teenager, now man, this was somebody who arguably should have probably been institutionalized. He was very, very, very ill and sick in his mind. I think his parents had expressed concerns. Where's the crossover between people searching for very dodgy things online, looking at very violent ideation and looking up Al-Qaeda manuals and all the rest of it, the full gamut of what you can access online, combined with, in this case, really, really severe mental health problems? Who's picking these people up? You know, are they meant to be dealt with so-called care in the community?
His father and mother, who are devout Christians, I think his older brother is also a devout Christian, they had warned about the possibility of Rudakubana going to school with a knife and trying to do this atrocity at a school. He was clearly had been motivated to act. And it does seem baffling that we are unable, not whether it's prevent or whatever the authorities involved are, to pick these people up when they are actually arming themselves to go and do something, and we still
How did
aren't
that
able.
not meet a bar? A parent is saying, my child is so disturbed that they may take a knife to school and start killing classmates. If that doesn't meet a bar somewhere, then something has gone so catastrophically wrong.
It will be interesting to see if Starmer can do anything, or a national government can do anything with what Starmer said was the platforms are responsible for having material about the Al-Qaeda manual, how to do an atrocity that just stays up and is there and can be easily found by people like Rudakubana, can be easily found by people like Jake Davison, can be easily found by anybody planning anything. Keir Starmer says part of this inquiry is how to stop that. Well, that takes us right back to Elon Musk and supposed freedom of speech.
Stop that. Admittedly, I think there is far too much stuff on the internet that just remains there. Nobody does anything about it. And if you are already of a warped mind and highly suggestible, then it can be really dangerous. If that happens to teenagers and they in any way become radicalized, the next stage is that the state and so-called safeguarding bodies step in and stage an intervention. So it's all very well going after the tech bros, but hang on a minute. What about our own institutions? I still find it unbelievable. 3 referrals, parents. I mean, let's listen to parents. They know their son better than anyone. Raising red flags going, something is going horribly wrong here with our son. Somebody needs to step in and help. Nobody seems to have done that. Let's hope the inquiry does uncover and answer some of these key questions, because for the victims of those, for the families of the victims of those girls, this so reminds me of when we spoke to Emma Webber, Barnaby Webber's mother, one of the 3 victims of Valdo Calacane. And the families are just there going, at every turn, the state has failed to protect our children.
There's going to be more bad news coming out, I'm sure, about those Nottingham murders, which we're going to be covering in the future. And of course, we'll be covering the sentencing of Rudakubana on Thursday.